for joining us this morning. This is session 1 of our Facilities and Business webinar series. And the topic today is School Construction Law Update. I'm joined this morning by Tyler Dawkins. My name is Devin Lincoln, and we're both here in the Monterey office of Lozano Smith presenting to you on this topic. It's an exciting, or at least an interesting year on school construction law. There have been numerous changes. We're going to focus on 3 main topics today in the following order. First, we're going to discuss mandatory pre-qualification, which we will elaborate on further, but which goes into effect on many school district construction projects beginning January 2014. Second, we're going to focus on recent changes to DSA certification and oversight of projects for both K-12 and community college districts. And finally, we'll touch on a recently passed bill that will go into effect in July 1st, 2014, that will have an impact on the bidding process. So those are our topics this morning. We're happy to field questions. In fact, we're delighted to field questions. It helps us understand what are your greatest concerns out there in the ether. If you can type your questions into the Q&A box, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. Only Tyler and I can see your questions, and so we will answer them. We will answer them verbally. And if there's a particular question I see that's relevant to the topic we're on, then we will probably answer that question right at the end of the discussion of that topic. But we've also reserved about 3 or 5 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer any other questions. So if something comes up for you and you want to get your question answered, please go ahead and send it our way, and we'll try to get to everybody. When you close out of this session, an evaluation form will pop up on your screen when you exit. We really appreciate the responses that we get to that evaluation form. They help us understand how the presentation went, whether we got your questions answered, and any feedback you have for future presentations. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send everyone a link to the recording after the event. If you haven't, I see that we have a question already about getting the PowerPoint. You should have received the materials already, I believe, yesterday from Lozano Smith, so if you check for that. If you don't have those readily available, I suggest sending an email to clientservices@lozanosmith.com, and they should be able to help you out this morning. Just if you don't already have the materials in a form that you can print and write on and you want them, that would be the best way to get them. Our next webinar, just so you can start putting it on your calendar, is going to be January 23rd on the Facilities and Business series. We give many different presentations of this sort, but the Facilities and Business strand January 23rd is going to be Financing Public Construction, What's Next in 2014 with Bonds, Parcel Taxes, and Public Finance. If you missed any of our past webinars and you want to know more, again, send an email to clientservices@lozanosmith.com. Okay, with that, I'm going to get going. Again, I'm Devin Lincoln, and we're going to talk about, first of all, we're going to talk about mandatory pre-qualification. If you've been doing school construction law for a long time, you are probably aware that it has been for quite some time an option to pre-qualify contractors on school district and community college projects. But beginning on January 1st of 2014, pre-qualification is going to be mandatory on some K-12 projects. And the criteria are that you be a school district, K-12 school district, with ADA greater than 2,500, that your project or projects are being funded with state bond funding, and that that I'm missing one more, and Tyler's going to pick up in a second. Because pre-qualification has always been an option, many people are going to be familiar with that pre-qualification, There are some slight differences between what we've done in the past under 20111.5 and what mandatory prequalification is going to be under 20111.6. The one thing I want to emphasize is even if your project doesn't qualify for prequal or you're not required to do mandatory prequal, you can if you wish to. So I've worked with a lot of clients. I'm sorry, I remember what the last thing I wanted to say is the project's over $1 million. If you have a project, let's say, that's $750,000, or you're a small school district under 2,500 ADA, and you still want to do prequal, well, that's still an option under 20111.5, but you'll want to pay attention to the details in how you do it. If you have a project over $1 million and you are a school district that's required to pre-qualify or you're getting state funding, then you're going to want to take a look at 20111.6. You know, just sort of generally, why is this coming up? We think either the legislature in passing mandatory pre-qualification indicated that the legislature has heard a number of complaints about general contractors who during the latest recession might not have been school professionals or might not have been experienced in school construction specifically. A lot of folks are just sort of desperate for work, low bid projects, and led to a lot of complications. Mandatory pre-qual seems to be the legislature's solution to that. I have some clients who love pre-qualification, have been using it for years, and others who don't. And if you're in the don't camp, best I can say is, you know, we've got some tools to help you get through it, and you know, we'll help you in this discussion to identify what some of the pitfalls are. Okay, with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tyler to discuss the details.
Okay, well, good morning to everybody. As Devin mentioned, my name is Tyler Dawkins. I'm going to spend about the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about the new pre-qualification requirements under the new Public Contract Code, Section 20111.6. So, as Devin mentioned, pre-qualification does not apply to every project. It only applies when the project meets a couple of specific criteria that trigger the requirement. Those criteria are spelled out in the new statute. I'm going to briefly touch on them here, although we're going to be going back to them over the course of the next 20 minutes or so in order to kind of remind everybody of the limitations of the scope of this new law. So as Devin briefly mentioned, the first of these major criteria are that the project has to have a projected expenditure of at least $1 million. So if the project is only reasonably expected to cost $700,000, then the new pre-qualification requirements are not going to apply. So that's the first major thing to keep in mind. The second, the project has to be funded either in whole or in part with state bond funds that are received pursuant to the existing school facilities program or any funds from any future state school bonds. So that's an important limit to keep in mind. So if the school district is funding the construction of a new high school, for example, and that funding is entirely out of local general obligation bonds, for example, then the new pre-qualification requirement is not going to apply. As Devin mentioned, the entire statutory requirement does not apply to schools with an average daily attendance of less than 2,500. So even if a school district that has 2,500 or less than 2,500 ADA is doing a project that's going to be over $1 million and it's going to use state bond funding, those projects will not require pre-qualification. So moving along to our next slide. So you've looked at these requirements and you've determined that pre-qualification is required. So our next questions become, when do you do it and how do you do it? And school districts have a couple of options here. First, a district can pre-qualify contractors on a project-by-project basis. So this option affords school districts a little more flexibility in terms of its pre-qualification materials, because the district can revise those materials for each new project. And this can be particularly helpful when, for example, the district is undertaking a project that has some very specialized components, and some of the contractors or applicable subcontractors are going to have to be very specialized, and the district wants to incorporate those requirements into their pre-qualification packet. So the other option for pre-qualification is that districts can pre-qualify contractors on a quarterly or annual basis. Now, as you might imagine, in this case, a district loses some of that flexibility that it would otherwise enjoy when pre-qualifying on a project-by-project basis, but it will decrease the frequency of conducting the actual pre-qualification process. And so districts stand, at least in theory, to reduce the time and reduce the cost of pre-qualifying contractors if they elect to do it on a quarterly or annual basis. Also, as you can see from the slide, if you can just go back to that last slide, as you can see from this slide, pre-qualification on a quarterly and annual basis is going to be valid for 1 calendar year following the date that the contractor is initially pre-qualified by the district. So that's something for districts to keep in mind when they're making that decision. So with regard to which method to choose, that's going to be based on kind of the unique circumstances of each school district, including considerations like, you know, how many projects are expected to be coming down the pike in the next year, and you know, will the district need to craft pre-qualification questionnaires to address specialty contractors, as I mentioned. Those are all considerations that the district will want to be thinking about when deciding whether or not to pre-qualify on a project-by-project basis or on a quarterly or annual basis. But the option is there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what each school district is required to do to satisfy this new pre-qualification requirement. So school districts are required to produce and provide a standardized pre-qualification questionnaire and financial statement. And this is sort of like the meat and potatoes of the pre-qualification process. And Devin's going to discuss this element in greater detail in a minute, so I'm not going to elaborate on it too much here. But as a standardized way to analyze the responses in that standardized questionnaire, school districts are also going to be required to have in place what's referred to as a uniform system of rating the bidders or rating the contractors. And for districts who have worked with voluntary pre-qualification in the past, they'll be familiar with this process, which basically amounts to a scorecard, if you will, for assigning value to the contractor's respective responses on the questionnaire. And the final tally of that score will determine whether the contractor is pre-qualified or not. Now, if the project is not going to, if the project is going to involve mechanical, electrical, or plumbing subcontractors, then those subcontractors also have to pre-qualify. So this is important to remember, and it's important to keep in mind that this new requirement does not only apply to general contractors. So if mechanical, electrical, or plumbing subcontractors are going to be involved with the project, then the school district is required to provide a list of all pre-qualified general contractors as well as pre-qualified mechanical, electrical, and plumbing subcontractors at least 5 days prior to the bid opening date. And so in addition to some of these requirements, the school district is also going to be required to provide each prospective bidder with a standardized proposal form. This is, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but this form is essentially just a bid form that school districts are already accustomed to using. So moving on to our next slide. As I noted a little earlier, school districts are going to be required to use the standardized questionnaire, which Devin will be discussing in a minute, and which is going to have to be submitted by the contractor who is seeking pre-qualification. And as I additionally mentioned, there's a couple of characteristics of this standardized questionnaire that are reflective of the existing pre-qualification process, but that are also important to note that these requirements carry forward into the new pre-qualification standardized questionnaire as well. And those are that the document has to be verified under oath, and that it's not going to be a public record subject to disclosure under the Public Records Act. Those are important things to keep in mind. Now, in addition to the questionnaire, I mentioned a moment ago that districts will be required to provide contractors with a standardized proposal form, which again is essentially just a normal bid proposal form that everyone is already kind of used to using. It's just important that it remains standardized and applicable to everyone. However, even though this is kind of a normal form that everybody's used to, as we're going to see on this slide, this bid form kind of becomes the gatekeeper, so to speak, for the pre-qualification process. So first of all, a school district is going to be required to reject a bid that is submitted without using the district's standard bid proposal form. And in addition, even when the correct proposal form is used, districts cannot accept a bid proposal from a contractor under a couple of specific circumstances, which I'm going to talk about right now. So first, the district is obligated to reject a proposal from a contractor who is required to complete the standardized questionnaire, but has not done so at least 10 business days prior to the date of the bid opening, or if that contractor has not been deemed pre-qualified by the district at least 5 business days prior to the bid opening date. Now, in a similar vein, this potential reason for rejecting bids is compounded, so to speak, by an additional requirement of the contractor. So a district is also required to reject bids from a general contractor who's submitting a bid proposal and is using a subcontractor who is required to pre-qualify. So remember, that's going to be your mechanical, electrical, or plumbing subs to the extent that they're being used on the job. If the general contractor is submitting a bid and they are using one or more of those categories of subcontractors, and any of those subcontractors have not completed the standard questionnaire at least 10 business days prior to the date of bid opening, or similarly have not been deemed pre-qualified by the district at least 5 business days prior to the bid opening date, then the bid also has to be rejected. So and that's kind of confusing. As you can see, the timing aspects of this are definitely an area for potential confusion. But the underlying thrust here is that the contractor or its subs are required to pre-qualify, and if they have not done so in a timely manner, the bid will not be accepted. So we're going to have a chance to kind of touch on some of these requirements again at the end of this particular segment of the webinar. We'll have an opportunity for some questions, as Devin mentioned. But first, I want to turn it back over to Devin to discuss some of the particulars of the questionnaire, as well as some of the additional nuances of this new program. So, Devin?
Great, thanks, Tyler. If you've done pre-qual in the past under a voluntary pre-qual system, you may be aware that the Department of Industrial Relations about 10-plus years ago was enjoined by the legislature to create a questionnaire to be used for pre-qual, and you can go on the DIR website and download that questionnaire. If you've worked with it before, you may find, as I usually have, that it's kind of bulky. It asks a lot of the questions more than once. The new legislation, the mandatory pre-qualification legislation, requires that your pre-qual forms include at least the issues covered by the DIR questionnaire. So we've had one question, can you use your own? Yes, you can. You can use your own form. However, you will want to verify very closely that your own form is one that is consistent with the DIR. Also, I want to let you all know that Lozano Smith has developed our own pre-qualification forms, and those are now available from us. And so you can, if you're interested in taking a look at that package, you can contact me or Tyler after this webinar. And we've tried to put together a user-friendly questionnaire that provides kind of a one-stop shop for all of the kind of questions you need to ask in the system. The other thing to be aware of is the universal rating system. I have always found to be a little bit of a pitfall for clients because you're required to have a universal rating system. You're not necessarily required to release it to the contractors. So it is absolutely, I think, imperative to have a neutral, standardized way that you're going to evaluate responses to a questionnaire. However, for instance, a yes answer to question 1 is worth 5 points. A no answer is worth only 2 points. So a system like that, and you apply the same rating system to everyone. But if you release that information along with the pre-qual packet, I think you need to consider unintended consequences, such as that a unscrupulous contractor may tailor his or her answers to your rating system so they know what they're going to pass. So I think that there are some good reasons to hold back your rating system while making sure it is a neutral and fair system. Okay. One issue I want to raise here, and it is certainly the kind of thing that us lawyers like to worry about, but Tyler has already covered the fact that pre-qualification, if a contractor does not pre-qualify within the appropriate timelines, that their bid form must not be accepted. What the legislation doesn't answer, though, is what is the procedure for rejecting that bid form. And we think that there is at least the potential for one or more contractors to argue that you can't reject my bid form on the grounds that either I didn't submit a pre-qual packet or I did submit and you found me unqualified without investigating my responsibility, not my responsiveness. For those of you who haven't been through this process before, in order for a low bid to be accepted by an agency, the low bidder must be the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Now, responsiveness is a question of whether or not you have appropriately filled out everything requested by your bid form. Responsibility is a question of whether or not you as a contractor are likely to perform the contract, whether you have the financial wherewithal, whether you have a record of disputes, all kinds of questions that really go to what's the character and nature of this entity. As you can imagine, contractors resist quite strenuously a responsibility finding or non-responsibility finding because it has a direct impact on their ability to do business. If you are going to find a contractor non-responsible, you must first give them an opportunity to respond to that allocation in a hearing, and you have to give them notice that that's the intent. What the new legislation doesn't answer is, if I review a pre-qual submission, determine on the basis of that pre-qual submission that the contractor is non-responsible, and therefore when they submit a bid form, I reject it, have I just made a decision about the responsibility, thereby requiring a responsibility hearing? Or has legislature given us a tool that the courts would support as saying that is a responsiveness issue? There are many who would like to think that because the legislature says you shall not accept a bid form from somebody pre-qualified, who is not pre-qualified, that therefore the legislature has converted a potential responsibility issue into a responsiveness issue. I have to say I'm not so sure, and if you find yourself in this situation where you have a low bidder who either didn't pre-qualify or didn't submit their form, and you're thinking you're going to need to reject them on the grounds that they were not pre-qualified, you may want to think hard about that, and you may even want to contact counsel before to figure out how best to negotiate making that determination. Okay, that's one of the big areas of questions we have about how to implement mandatory pre-qual. The other is which projects will be subject outside of the three requirements we've already covered, right? We've covered projects need to be over $1 million in value, they need to be state bond funded, and they need to be you need to be a school district ADA over 2,500. What about lease-leaseback? This question one of our attendees has already posed. It's a really good question. My reaction to that question is that, as many of you know, lease-leaseback is a education code exception to the public contract code bidding requirements. And so those of us who use lease-leaseback frequently as a contracting method think of it and use it as an exception to the bidding requirements we've been discussing generally here. OPSC, the Office of Public School Construction, which is the gatekeeper for state bond funding, has in the past, getting close to 10 years ago now, but not so long ago, questioned the validity of using lease-leaseback as an exception to bidding requirements. And that is a topic that we could spend an hour on, but the question remains, when OPSC goes to approve funding for one of these projects, if you've done your project through lease-leaseback, are you going to be required to pre-qualify? Statutorily, I'd say no, because the requirements we've been reviewing here for mandatory pre-qualification apply to projects that are being publicly bid, not to public projects that are negotiated directly with the contractor under lease-leaseback. But we have heard some rumors that OPSC will be inquiring into the method of contracting for your project, and then if you've done a lease-leaseback project, have you also done pre-qualification? We've tried to track down the source of those rumors. We've called OPSC, and we've gotten really very little response. So there's two ways to interpret that. My personal hunch is that if you have been doing a lease-leaseback process in the past, that OPSC is not going to look differently at lease-leaseback now that there's mandatory pre-qual than they did a year ago. Meaning that if you're using lease-leaseback, then you are not going to need to work within the mandatory pre-qual system. However, I'm a lawyer, which makes me naturally risk-averse, and if you are concerned about making sure you get that state funding, you may very well want to implement a pre-qualification process or some other very similar selection process for your lease-leaseback contractor, just in case OPSC does really start scrutinizing this system, because right now we just don't have enough hard information. Okay, another question. What about Prop 39 projects or other solar projects or projects covered by Government Code Section 4217? If you have been doing any of those projects or you're gearing up for a Prop 39 project, You're aware that under Prop 39 funding is going to be coming from state taxes. So right away, I would say, you know, if you're doing a Prop 39 project and it's not being subsidized by state bond funds, you probably don't have to mandatory pre-qualify. Also, many projects under Government Code Section 4217, which if you're not familiar with it, take my word for it now, is another bidding exception to public bidding that applies to energy conservation projects like solar projects and other similar projects. Again, I'd say, like lease spec, it's an exception to public bidding and therefore does not require pre-qual. But again, we will need to wait and see a little bit. So again, it's a question worth asking when you're doing your selection process for contractors on Prop 39 and other green projects. One other thing I want to mention, and then I want to get to some of the great questions we're getting, is that some districts, many of our clients are now uniform cost districts. If you become a uniform cost district, you've moved yourself out of the 20111 section of the Public Contract Code, and you're operating under the uniform cost system. Again, I would question whether mandatory pre-qualification applies in those circumstances, and I would contact legal counsel to discuss that issue. So if you're uniform cost, take a look at whether or not you actually want to pre-qualify or whether you're required to pre-qualify, because I question that. Okay, so let's see, we've gotten a lot of questions here. I want to answer them quickly before we move on to DSA oversight. Let's see, I had a question, I think I addressed it, but I'll cover it real quickly. Can you use your own form? Do you have to use the DIR form? If you have a form that you like or you want to use Lozano-Smith form, that's great. Just be sure that whatever form you're using covers the areas covered by DIR. And that's something you can verify just by downloading that form from the DIR website. During bidding, do you still have to submit ads in the newspaper to find bidders, or can you call from your pre-qual list? I think this question has to do specifically with if you've done a pre-qual process, you know, do you then only submit the bid forms to the people who have pre-qualified? What I think is probably going to be the most logical process here is going to be to, when you advertise for bids, advertise simultaneously that there's a mandatory pre-qualification process, so that contractors who are interested in bidding that project or projects will have to get the pre-qual packet, submit it, and they submit it up to 10 days before the bid. And I would make clear in your advertisement that only bidders who have done that process will be permitted to submit bids. And again, you know, if you have somebody who submits a form anyway, that's definitely a case where you want to call counsel. But I think that's the best way to control it. So wrap the pre-qual process into your advertisement process. If you pre-qual on a quarterly basis and then you then advertise for projects within that quarter or in a year, also you're going to want to reference in your ad that there already has been a pre-qual process. So there are some intricacies there with advertising. Okay, now, does the pre-qual form have to be board approved, or if so, does it have to be a board policy or resolution? This is going to be on a case-by-case basis. There is no requirement in the Public Contract Code that the pre-qual form go before your board. So I would say that you don't need to go to the board. However, because this is a process that really, especially if you've got a big bond program, big construction program that is going to get some scrutiny, there are many reasons to take your pre-qual form to the board and keep your board advised of what the process is going to be, get the board's blessing on, for instance, pre-qualifying on a quarterly or annual basis. So it's not a legal question so much as a practice question, and what are your norms within your organization of dealing with the board, and what does the board expect to see? Finally, let's see, got two more questions. What about the oath? Does it need to be signed and notarized? And the answer there is yes. The oath is a notarized requirement that's in your pre-qual packet, and I think I've already addressed how this all applies to lease-back. So if you've got other questions about pre-qual, please go ahead and send them to us. They're great questions. But I'm going to move on just so we can get to our other topics to DSA oversight. Some of you may be aware that this new system went into practice on June 1st of this year, and it really has stepped up the level of scrutiny that DSA is applying to both K-12 and community college projects. Why? Well, if you've worked in school district construction for a while, you know that one of the biggest problems that we face is projects that never get closed out. I saw some statistics that about 25% of DSA projects that were finished or closed by school districts and community college districts in the past 3 years were uncertified, meaning they weren't closed out through DSA. Final paperwork wasn't submitted. And DSA's got egg on its face about that. So casting around for a way to kind of implement its authority, DSA settled on a process that would be familiar to anybody working in the with city-sponsored or county-sponsored projects, which is there are a couple of different names for it. You heard job card or continuous certification. Essentially, the idea is that at each phase of your project, you are going to need DSA's approval to move forward, and you're going to need DSA's approval at the completion of each phase. That process is going to be administered through your inspector of record. One thing here that may not have been honoring up till now, but you're going to need to is DSA regulations have always required that there be an IOR in place before you start construction. With this new system, you simply can't even move forward without having that IOR in place, and you're going to need DSA's approval even to begin your project. What is this going to mean for you? Well, you know, I think it's fair to say that what it's going to mean, and some of you may already be experiencing this on projects that were complete, where it started this summer, is that you're going to need to make sure that you've got somebody, either the architect or if you use one, a construction manager, administering this job card program and making sure that you're complying with DSA. It's also probably going to entail some delay because, you know, even a day or two of seeking approval from DSA to move on is going to be a day or two. So two words to wise before Tyler really gets down into the details. Make sure, if you haven't already, that the documents you use with your architect, with your IOR, with your construction manager reflect, and with your contractor, reflect that this is a real and valid requirement. Also, really talk to your architect about time that's being built into your contract and whether the time that you're calculating on includes enough time to comply with these new job card requirements. Okay, with that, I'm going to give it back over to Tyler to talk about some of the details of how this is going to work.
Okay, so as Devin mentioned, DSA's new requirements involve something that DSA is referring to as a project inspection card. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, about the new card and some of the responsibilities of the various parties that are going to be involved. And then I'm going to touch on some of the consequences of not following this new requirement and some of the kind of overall pros and cons. So some of the basic characteristics of this new method of documenting project inspection. At the outset of a project, as Devin mentioned, this applies to projects beginning after June 1st of 2013. For projects beginning after that date, project inspection cards must be issued by DSA to the inspector of record, as Devin mentioned. And these inspection cards are going to be used by the inspector to track and sign off various milestones of the project as the work is completed. So as mentioned, this concurrent tracking process is kind of at the core of this new requirement and is intended to prevent the existing backlog of projects that are completed but don't have DSA inspection certification. And the idea, as Devin mentioned, is to sort of prevent that backlog from growing and hopefully decrease it and reduce it and eliminate it over time. There will be an inspection card for each building on a project and one for site work as well. So if you only have one building and no site work, then there will only be one card, but for larger projects, it will be normal to have several different cards applicable to the various structures that are being built. The cards contain 9 general milestone categories or sections of work, which are then broken down into more specific subsections. For example, there's sections for foundation and vertical framing and site work, and then each one of those sections will have a few more specific subsections. And if a building or a project doesn't include some of those, then those particular sections just won't be used. But these are the areas in which the inspector will be indicating compliance and checking off on each particular stage of the project. So the cards will be issued electronically by DSA, and the inspector is required to keep them current, to keep a current inspection card on DSA's new online system that they're calling DSA Box. There is a user's manual for this new online process on DSA's website. So if you need more information about that, that's an excellent resource. The system in general is intended, at least in part, to provide an easy access to up-to-date project documents. As we'll see as we go through the slides, a lot of this new program is aimed at streamlining and increasing access to documents and increasing transparency. Now, with respect to this new mechanism of documentation, DSA has laid out several responsibilities for each party that's involved. And I'm going to kind of go through them and briefly highlight some of those responsibilities on the next few slides so that we get an idea of one of the underlying goals of DSA, which, as I mentioned, is to sort of encourage this open and up-to-date communication and prompt resolution of issues and prompt inspections. So as we see on this slide, this is just a few of the inspector's responsibilities. And as I mentioned, a couple of these requirements are intended to encourage that open communication and encourage a sufficient quality of work. But in addition, the inspector is also required to ensure that the correct number of inspection cards are issued by DSA. And of course, the inspector is also responsible for maintaining those cards and signing off on those cards in order to indicate that each particular section of work complies with the DSA-approved construction documents, that all documentation has been received by the inspector, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, and that any testing and general inspecting that has to be done has actually been completed for that particular subsection of work. Now, additionally, the inspector is required to notify DSA if construction commences without the issuance of an inspection card, or if you're in the middle of a project and the next phase of construction work commences without having completed the inspection card requirement for the prior stage of work, the inspector is also required to notify DSA about that. So the architect and other design professionals on the project have several responsibilities as well. And as I mentioned, what you see on these slides with respect to the responsibilities of these various parties is not an exhaustive list. The responsibilities that DSA lists are numerous, and so if you want to review all those requirements, and I would absolutely encourage you to do so, just go to DSA's website and look up, you can pull up either construction oversight or the DSA procedure that contains all this information is PR 13-01. So a couple of important responsibilities of the architect are listed here. Generally, there is language in the DSA procedure that highlights the architect's responsibility to the school board and DSA to see that the completed work conforms to the DSA-approved construction documents, and also to provide general direction to the inspector to help ensure that compliance. More specifically, however, and more importantly for a piece of our discussion here, is the requirement that the architect submit what DSA is calling an interim verification report to the inspector as well as DSA for each applicable section of the inspection card. So what is critical to note here is that the inspector must receive this report, this interim report from the architect, prior to signing off on the applicable section of the inspection card. So we'll see, we'll talk a little bit about what effects that might have in just a minute, but first I'm going to just touch on some of the responsibilities of the contractor as well as the school district. So with respect to the contractor, DSA imposes a requirement to notify the inspector in writing of the commencement of each aspect of work at least 48 hours in advance. And then, after the contractor completes each aspect of work, the contractor is required again to notify the inspector of that completion. Now, in addition to these and some of the other contractor requirements that are not listed here, but which are contained in DSA's procedure, the contractor is also required to submit a final verified report both to DSA and the inspector at the end of the project. So it's important to note here that this report is a final report and not an interim report like the one that's required for architects. And so it's not going to be required as a condition of the inspector signing off on each particular subsection of work. So moving on to some of the responsibilities of the school district with respect to this new inspection card and inspection card process. The school district's responsibilities are going to include a number of things that are generally aimed at ensuring that proper work and proper inspection are made possible. So, for example, districts are going to be required to provide adequate inspection by employing a DSA certified inspector. Another example is that a school district is required to, it's going to be required to contractually help ensure compliance by building some of these requirements into their construction agreements and architect agreements, as Devin mentioned at the outset. So of additional interest here, there is a requirement that school districts submit what DSA is referring to as a statement of final actual project costs. And this is essentially a basic accounting document. It includes, general cost accounting items like the original contract sum, the amount of change orders, the amount of management costs, and things of that nature. So, again, these are just some of the responsibilities of each of the parties with regard to this new process. Now, let's talk about some what-ifs here. In particular, what if the contractor goes ahead with the construction of the next phase of a project without the inspection, without the inspector having signed off and conducted the inspection on the prior work? So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, first and foremost, the inspector is required to notify DSA immediately if the contractor's subsequent work is going to cover up the work that has not yet received inspection approval. But in addition to that, if the contractor does go ahead and proceed without that prior approval and performs work that does cover up the non-approved work, then the contractor will be subject to a stop work order, which can be issued either by DSA or the school district. And of course, the work that covers up any non-approved work would also be subject to any kind of removal or remediation that was necessary if it wasn't compliant with the construction documents. So kind of pulling all of these issues together, briefly want to just touch on some of the impacts of these changes. And as Devin kind of mentioned at the outset, one of the things that most people expect to see is an increase in project time. So as I mentioned, the contractor can't proceed with the work until the inspector signs off on it, and the inspector can't sign off on it until he or she receives the verified interim report from the architect. So of course, this required sort of chain of events is unlikely to always work out in a timely manner, and the result is likely to be a collection of small to medium delays that could add up to a significant amount of time over the project. And as a result of this, architects and contractors are probably going to account for this process in the development of their schedules, and we're likely to see a correlating increase in costs, both from the architect and also in the bid amounts from contractors, which ultimately increases the overall cost of the project. But on the upside, however, if this is an effective procedure, then the process, in theory, will decrease that backlog of incomplete DSA-certified projects and help close out so many of those outstanding projects. And so overall, while it's going to take probably a little time for everyone to adjust to the new process, it is important to consider these changes now and at the outset of future projects to ensure that all of your contract documents effectively deal with these problems. So we're going to move on to the new legislation that's just recently passed, and maybe we have a minute to take a couple of questions on the new DSA oversight, and if not, we can hold some of those questions for the end.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I'm just going to spend a minute or so on this new bill. I want to highlight it because it's something that it's actually one of the few, it's some good news, and then I'm going to try and get through as many of the questions as we have received as I can. Chronologically, to keep in mind from the topics we've covered today, you've got June 1st of this year meant that we're now under these new DSA inspection card requirements we've just been talking about. January 1st coming up is when you're going to be thinking about mandatory pre-qual. This last bill that we're going to talk about is not going to kick in until next summer, July 1st. However, what it requires is that when general contractors in a bid form are required to list their subcontractors, and that's usually on scopes of work where the subcontractor scope is going to be more than 0.5%. There's a slightly lower threshold in case you're working on a street or highway project, but for most of our K-12 and community college districts, we're talking about 0.5% of the total bid price. The law has now been clarified that you also have to list that your subcontractor's valid license. Lozano Smith bid forms, many other bid forms have always required that information, but this new bill will now make it clear that legislatively you're required to have them. And it cannot, the fact that somebody has not included a license number can't be the basis for somebody else's bid protest. But if a subcontractor, or sorry, if a general contractor, a low bidder, has not filled in the right license number, they have 24 hours to fix it. So that's all useful tools in the bid process that are going to be nice to see. Okay, so without spending more time on AB 44, I want to take some of the questions we've been getting. First of all, I have some questions back on pre-qual. First question, how recent does a contractor's financial statement have to be? You know, that's not a question that's answered by the legislation. Lozano Smith forms, and I think the DIR forms as well, require the most recent audited statement. There's also a question in here, does it have to be an audited statement? And I would say yes, or at least that's a good practice to request to an audited form. Sometimes you get a contractor who says, well, I only do annual reporting. I'm not a publicly traded company. I'm always going to want the latest quarterly statement if I can get it. And I think that you want the latest audited quarterly statement if you can get it. If all that's available is I would say in order of priority is most recent, second highest priority is that it be audited, and then you try to get the most current information that really will allow you to evaluate the condition of that contractor. I have a question. If using CM, Construction Manager, Multiple Prime project, does the $1 million limit apply to the whole project or to the packages containing MEP, mechanical, engineering, and plumbing? I think the answer there is twofold. First of all, of course, the Public Contract Code frowns on bid splitting. No PSC in particular frowns on bid splitting. So if you've divided what was originally or might be thought of as one big project into multiple packages because that's what works for you strategically, but you are going to submit the whole to OPSC for funding of the state bond program, I would consider the whole when deciding whether or not pre-qualification is required. You can certainly take the position that the lesser project is where it is under $1 million and therefore pre-qual isn't required, but I hate to see you get your funding denied because you've taken that stance. So again, if you've got a project that you may be divided into various portions for all kinds of good reasons, but is going to OPSC as a whole, then I try to then I do pre-qual if you can. Let's see. Okay, so then those are the questions I see right now about pre-qual. Going to questions about DSA oversight. Is DSA going to be willing to participate in a pre-construction meeting designed specifically to address the DSA process during the project? So far, I don't know whether that's actually occurring. I think that you're going to want to get those questions answered with DSA at your last back check meeting with your architect. I don't see that DSA has the staff or the time to really iron out the kinks. So one thing I'd be looking for in selecting architects right now is an architect who's already starting to be familiar with this system and has it in place. Also, IORs are just getting up to speed. I think the community that really doesn't understand this new process as well is going to be the contractor community. So, but I would not look to DSA to be the one that really helps implement this process. I would say your architect, in most cases, is going to be the leader on implementing the process. Next question, will all of these requirements, the DSA requirements, be needed for closeout with the OPSC audit team or just the accounting part? I think OPSC, we're talking about two different separate projects here, separate processes here. DSA is going to require that you complete all of the inspection card project process to complete the certification process with DSA. OPSC is not going to be all that interested in whether or not you close out with DSA. They're going to still be interested in how did you select your contractor and how did you contract for that construction. And if the question is OPSC going to want to know, did you get financials from the contractor? they are, but they're also just going to want to simply know that you did a pre-qual process. They're probably not going to be investigating, did you do a pre-qual process and was it fair and regular? So you're going to just need to be able to certify, yes, we did pre-qual on projects that are subject to pre-qual. 2 more questions. Does the inspection card take the place of the letter of approval that DSA normally sent prior to starting the project? Yes, this is a new system. And now we have this new system where you're going to get your inspection card before you can start your project. And finally, there's a question, will this new requirement affect progress payments or retention payments? I would say yes. I mean, if a contractor has not met the requirements to complete a phase of a project, then it's a conversation you're probably going to have with your architect and maybe also with your attorney. I wouldn't consider whether or not to release a progress payment when a phase is not complete. I mean, if you've got a progress payment request that shows that a phase is complete and yet it has not met DSA certification, then then you really need to hold the contractor's feet to the fire to get that done. This has been a great session. I really appreciate all of the questions. Obviously, there's a lot going on out there, and it's all coming at a time when our clients are finally building again. So if you're in that position, good luck out there. If you have questions, if you want to see Lozano Smith's pre-qualification forms, please go ahead and give us a call or drop us a line. And really appreciate all of the participation today, and thank you very much.